It started like most quiet Saturdays, sunlight breaking through my kitchen blinds, the smell of fresh coffee, and a long overdue home project I'd been planning for months. The cedar fence boards leaned neatly against my garage wall, waiting for me to finally give my backyard some privacy. After 20 years on the bench, I'd learned that a little solitude was worth its weight in gold. I wasn't just any retiree with a hammer. I was Judge Michael Webb, recently retired from the county circuit court, now trying to enjoy the simple life in a suburban paradise called Maplewood Estates. At least that's what the brochure promised. I had no idea that this so-called paradise would turn into a battlefield ruled by one woman's ego, and that woman had no idea who she was picking a fight with. Her name was Cordelia Blackthorne, the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, the kind of person who believed a rule book gave her divine authority. I'd heard whispers about her during neighborhood gatherings, how she once fined a veteran for displaying the American flag a few inches off-center, how she made a young couple repaint their door 3 times because burgundy wasn't regulation red. I used to laugh at those stories. I wasn't laughing anymore when I saw her Lexus pull up in front of my house that morning. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched like armor, she walked across my lawn with the kind of confidence you only see in people who've never been told no. "Good morning," she said in that polished tone that always hides a threat. "I couldn't help but notice you're putting up a fence." I smiled, polite but firm. "Yes, ma'am. Got my permit right here. City approved." I gestured toward the document taped inside my garage window. She barely glanced at it. "That's a city permit," she said. "This is an HOA community. You also need board approval for external modifications." Her voice was honey over gravel. "It's just a privacy fence," I replied. "Within the property line, matching materials, nothing illegal." She tilted her head, scanning the boards like a hawk hunting field mice. "The height doesn't conform to aesthetic standards," she announced. I couldn't resist the sarcasm that slipped out. "Aesthetic standards? You mean the ones written in invisible ink? Because I've read your bylaws cover to cover." Her lips tightened. "If you continue without approval, I'll have to escalate this." "By all means," I said, picking up my saw. "Escalate away." I didn't think she'd actually do it. 12 minutes later, I was wrong. The sound of police sirens shattered the calm morning. My neighbor Marcus peeked from behind his truck, shaking his head in disbelief as 2 squad cars pulled up. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. The officers approached, professional but clearly confused. "Sir, we got a report of illegal construction and trespassing," one said. I handed over my papers. Property deed, survey, permits, all neatly filed. Because if life teaches you one thing as a judge, it's that preparation beats panic every single time. Sergeant Rodriguez took one look at the documents, then at Cordelia, who stood on the sidewalk like she was watching justice unfold in her favor. "Ma'am," he said, "everything checks out. This gentleman is building on his own property. There's no violation here." Cordelia's face hardened. "The HOA still needs to approve aesthetics," she snapped. Rodriguez's tone dropped a notch colder. "Ma'am, you're currently trespassing on private property." The pause that followed could have powered the whole street. Cordelia sputtered something about community oversight and retreated to her car, heels clicking like angry punctuation marks. As the officers left, Marcus wandered over with a grin. "Well," he said, "that was something." I smiled back. "Yeah, she has no idea who she's dealing with." That moment changed everything. I realized this wasn't about offense, it was about control. And in all my years dealing with corrupt city officials, I'd learned one thing. Bullies hide behind bureaucracy. Cordelia had just declared war, and I wasn't the kind of man to lose without a fight. That night, while the neighborhood lights dimmed, I opened my laptop and downloaded every HOA document available: bylaws, financial statements, meeting minutes. Most of it was routine fluff, but one detail stood out like a red flag in a snowstorm: $388,000 in annual dues from 147 households. Maplewood wasn't exactly Beverly Hills, so where was all that money going? Landscaping contracts totaling $89,000 to a company called Pinnacle Property Services. Pool maintenance, another $47,000. Utilities for a building that sat empty most of the year, $31,000. I'd seen that pattern before. Fake vendors, inflated invoices, money vanishing behind a veil of maintenance. A few clicks later, my suspicion became certainty. Pinnacle Property Services was registered to one Derek Blackthorne, Cordelia's brother-in-law. I leaned back in my chair, the bitter taste of old courtroom memories flooding back. It wasn't just corruption, it was family business. By Monday morning, my mailbox was full of retaliation. 4 violation notices, back to back. Unapproved landscaping modifications because I'd planted tomatoes. Outdoor storage, because my hose was on a reel. Architectural non-compliance, for having a different doormat. And the masterpiece, parking violation, for leaving my pickup truck in my own driveway. Total fines, $800 escalating daily. Marcus called that evening, laughing in disbelief. She's really doing it, huh? Oh, she's doing it, I said, my voice calm but my mind racing. She's just too arrogant to realize she's building her own case file. Because while Cordelia was busy weaponizing HOA rules, I was documenting everything, photos, emails, voicemails. Every petty infraction she invented became another piece of evidence in what I was starting to call the Maplewood file. I had a rule. Never fight emotion with emotion. You fight it with proof. The more I documented, the more neighbors came forward. Mrs. Chen brought cookies one afternoon and whispered that Cordelia fined her $100 for unauthorized flora because she'd planted jasmine. A young couple admitted they were thinking of moving after endless harassment over their paint color. Marcus showed me his $200 fine for reflective glare from solar panels. The pattern was clear as day. Cordelia wasn't enforcing standards, she was enforcing silence. Anyone who questioned her authority was targeted until they gave up or moved away. But she'd picked the wrong target this time. I wasn't leaving. I'd spent years in courtrooms watching arrogant people collapse under their own lies. Now I was about to teach that lesson in my own neighborhood. When Cordelia called an emergency board meeting to address resident non-compliance, I made sure to attend. She didn't expect me to show up. The look on her face when I walked in, folder under my arm, recorder in my pocket, was priceless. "Oh," she said tightly. "Judge Webb. Didn't expect to see you here. Public meeting, isn't it?" I said, taking a seat. 2 board members, Eleanor, a retired teacher, and Bob, an insurance agent, looked uneasy. The meeting began, filled with Cordelia's usual theater about maintaining community values. When she got to resident compliance issues, I stood. "Before we proceed," I said, "I'd like to submit evidence of selective enforcement and potential financial irregularities." The room froze. I laid out printed invoices, photographs, and a breakdown of every inflated payment to Pinnacle Property Services. Then I asked the question that broke the silence. "Where's the record of competitive bidding for these contracts?" Cordelia's jaw tightened. "This isn't the place." "Actually," I interrupted, "this is exactly the place. These meetings are required by law to be transparent. So please, enlighten us." Bob looked down at the numbers, eyes widening. "Wait a second," he said. "This company gets 65% of our annual budget?" Eleanor frowned. "That can't be right." Cordelia tried to regain control. "Judge Webb is using his position to intimidate board members. I move to restrict his attendance due to conflict of interest." Bob leaned back, voice steady. Motion dies for lack of a second. The silence that followed was beautiful. Cordelia's power cracked like old paint. I'd seen that look before, panic behind a fake smile. She gathered her papers, muttering about legal consultation, and ended the meeting early. I walked home under the warm glow of the streetlights, the night air thick with the smell of cut grass and quiet rebellion. I knew exactly what would happen next. She'd double down. People like Cordelia always do when the truth corners them. But what she didn't realize was that I'd already moved the battle to higher ground. I spent the next day combing through state HOA oversight laws, criminal penalties for embezzlement, fiduciary breaches, even personal liability for board misconduct. By midnight, my printer was spitting out page after page of evidence, and I was smiling. I'd seen corruption in courthouses, but this was personal. She'd turned my neighborhood into a playground for her ego, and now the rules were mine to enforce. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was preparing to dismantle the entire corrupt system, one legal clause at a time. The following week felt like walking through invisible crosshairs. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel eyes from behind curtains. Cordelia's influence ran deep. She had her loyal few, people who thought siding with power meant protection. They whispered at mailbox corners, traded glances when I passed, and smiled those tight, polite smiles that vanish as soon as you look away. I'd seen juries like that, quiet until the verdict comes in. Still, I kept my head down, doing what I always did best, build a case. The Maplewood file had grown to a binder thick enough to choke a shredder. Every email from Cordelia, every photograph of her selective enforcement, every witness statement from my neighbors, it was all there, layered and airtight. What I didn't know then was that Cordelia was already planning her next move, and it was going to be bigger than fines and warnings. It started on a Thursday morning. I was walking Scout, my old golden retriever, when a black SUV rolled up beside me. 2 uniformed officers stepped out. For a moment, I thought it was just routine patrol until one of them said my name. "Judge Michael Webb?" "That's me," I said, tugging gently on Scout's leash. "You're under investigation for trespassing on HOA property," the officer said, voice measured. My pulse spiked. "Trespassing?" I repeated. "On my own street?" He handed me a folded paper, an incident report filed by none other than Cordelia Blackthorne. According to her statement, I had been caught entering the HOA's administrative storage unit without authorization late at night. It was complete fiction. I'd been home that evening reviewing case files. But she wasn't after truth. She was after headlines. The HOA had an old shed near the pool area used to store maintenance tools. Cordelia claimed there was video evidence. I almost laughed. "Officers," I said calmly, "I'm sure you'll find the footage as convincing as a children's cartoon. But for the record, I'd like to file a counter-report for malicious prosecution." They looked at each other, uncertain. "Sir, we're just following procedure," one of them said. I nodded, not angry, just disappointed that her games had reached this level. That night, I drove to the HOA office building, this time with a camera of my own. The place was locked as expected, but what caught my attention wasn't inside. It was the security camera mounted above the door, flashing red like a heartbeat. I traced the cable down to an ancient recorder in the utility box. A notice on it read, "System not operational." That told me everything I needed to know. The video evidence she mentioned didn't exist. She was bluffing, counting on fear to make me fold. She'd miscalculated. The next morning, I filed a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office for harassment and fraudulent reporting. I also notified the state's Homeowners Association Oversight Division, attaching my binder of evidence and requesting a financial audit of Maplewood Estates. Once you light the match of investigation, the fire doesn't ask for permission. Within days, whispers turned to panic. Cordelia's allies started avoiding her calls. Eleanor, the retired teacher, stopped by my house one evening, visibly shaken. "Michael," she said softly, "I didn't know about the money, I swear. She told us the landscaping was a special contract." I handed her a glass of water and smiled. "It's all right, Eleanor. The truth has a way of surfacing." What I didn't tell her was that the auditors had already reached out to me for verification of several documents. Cordelia would soon have to explain under oath. 2 weeks later, my phone rang. The caller ID read County Court Administration. "Judge Webb," the clerk said, "there's been a petition filed against you for defamation by the Maplewood Estates HOA. I couldn't help but chuckle. Defamation? Well, that's one way to stall an audit. "You'll need to appear for a preliminary hearing next Friday," she added. "Of course," I said. "It'll be good to visit an old courtroom again." The day of the hearing, the courthouse lobby smelled like floor polish and history. I'd walked those halls for 2 decades, but this time I was the defendant. Reporters had gathered, sniffing scandal. Cordelia arrived with a lawyer who looked barely out of law school, carrying a briefcase twice his confidence level. She wore a white suit, the color of false innocence. When the clerk called the case, we stepped forward. The presiding judge was someone I'd mentored years ago, Thomas Reed. He looked at me over his glasses with quiet understanding. "Gentlemen," he said, "and Ms. Blackthorne, I expect decorum." Her lawyer began with rehearsed outrage, claims of harassment, invasion of privacy, emotional distress. He painted me as a retired judge abusing influence to bully a community volunteer. Then it was my turn. I didn't need theatrics. I let the evidence speak. Bank statements, shell companies, invoices signed by her brother-in-law, copies of emails threatening residents with fines unless they complied immediately. Each page hit the table like a drumbeat. When I finished, the room was silent. Cordelia's lawyer fumbled with his notes. Judge Reed leaned back. "Ms. Blackthorne," he said slowly, "are you aware that filing a defamation suit while under state audit may constitute obstruction if the intent is to deter testimony?" Her face drained of color. I wasn't aware an audit was active," she stammered. "Oh, but it is," he replied. "And given the circumstances, I'm dismissing this case pending completion of that audit." The gavel dropped. I exhaled, feeling the tension unravel in my shoulders. Cordelia stormed out, cameras flashing, lips pressed tight. But the real show was yet to come. The audit findings landed 3 weeks later like a meteor. Over $200,000 misappropriated through fake maintenance contracts, unauthorized withdrawals, personal expenses disguised as community outreach. When the report went public, the neighborhood erupted. For the first time, people who'd been silent found their voices. Marcus organized a meeting at the park. Families showed up with folding chairs, kids running between them. There was anger, disbelief, but also relief, because truth, no matter how painful, cleanses. I stood before them not as a judge, not as an enemy, but as a neighbor. "This community deserves transparency," I said. "HOA boards exist to serve, not rule." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then louder. Someone shouted, "Run for board president!" I smiled. "Let's just get fair elections first." Cordelia was removed within a month, pending criminal investigation. Her Lexus disappeared from the street. The new board, led by Eleanor and Marcus, asked me to advise on drafting new bylaws that limited board power and required annual independent audits. It was the kind of reform that turns chaos into accountability. But victory never feels clean. Some neighbors still avoided me, afraid of being associated with controversy. I didn't blame them. Change scares people. Still, every morning when I saw Scout running free in the yard behind my newly finished fence, I knew it had been worth it. Then, one evening, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Cordelia, standing outside the courthouse steps, glaring into the camera. On the back, in shaky handwriting, "This isn't over." I looked at it for a long moment, then placed it in my file drawer under a new label. Pending closure. Because the truth is, justice isn't a one-time act. It's a habit. And as long as I was breathing, I'd keep practicing it, whether in a courtroom or on my own street. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, the kind of silence that comes after a thunderstorm. Heavy, watchful, almost too calm. Maplewood Estates was breathing again, but I could sense the unease that lingers when people realize the monster they feared is gone, but the memory remains. I busied myself with repairs around the house, replaced the fence boards, painted the mailbox, sanded the porch swing until the wood felt smooth as glass. Scout would lie nearby, his tail thumping lazily while I worked. But even in peace, my mind stayed restless. Cordelia's note wasn't just a threat. It was a reminder that corruption doesn't vanish. It retreats, waiting for complacency. A month later, the county investigator called. "Judge Webb," she said, "we're filing formal charges. Fraud, embezzlement, falsifying records, and conspiracy to obstruct justice." I thanked her. But inside I felt no triumph, only the solemn satisfaction of duty done. Justice is rarely joyful. It's necessary. That night I took a walk through the neighborhood. Porch lights glowed warm behind curtains, and laughter floated from somewhere down the block. Kids' bikes leaned against mailboxes that no longer carried violation letters. For the first time in years, Maplewood looked like a place where life could happen without permission slips. I stopped by the park and sat on the bench Marcus had helped rebuild. The wood smelled faintly of cedar and new beginnings. 2 weeks later, subpoenas went out to every former board member. The local paper ran a front-page headline: HOA corruption, probe expands. Judge Webb's evidence leads to major indictments. Reporters camped outside my driveway for days, hoping for a statement. I gave them none. This wasn't about publicity. It was about accountability. When the trial finally began, I attended not as a judge, not even as a witness, just a citizen sitting quietly in the gallery. Cordelia entered the courtroom in handcuffs, her posture defiant, her eyes searching for sympathy that wasn't there. The same confidence that once filled her HOA meetings had evaporated under fluorescent lights and sworn testimony. The prosecution laid out everything: forged invoices, fraudulent reimbursements, coercion, threats. Neighbors I hadn't seen in months took the stand, their voices steady but their hands trembling. They spoke of intimidation, of fear, of nights spent crying over fines they couldn't afford. When Eleanor testified, her voice cracked midway. "We trusted her," she said softly. "She made us believe she was protecting our community, but all she did was tear it apart." In that moment, I felt the weight of Maplewood's collective grief, the betrayal of good faith, the erosion of trust. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. The verdict came back unanimous, guilty on nearly every count. Cordelia's face didn't change. Only her eyes flickered with something I couldn't name, anger, maybe, or realization. As they led her away, she turned once, meeting my gaze for a heartbeat. There was no hatred there, only recognition. She understood now that justice wasn't personal. It was inevitable. The sentencing took place 2 weeks later. 4 years in federal prison, restitution, permanent loss of her real estate license. The courtroom murmured, some relieved, others just stunned. I walked out into the sunlight feeling lighter, not because Cordelia was gone, but because truth had finally replaced fear. That evening, the board gathered at the community center for an open meeting, our first since the verdict. Every seat was filled. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras rolling, microphones ready. I stood at the podium, the same place where Cordelia once ruled through intimidation. My voice felt steady, grounded. 6 months ago, I began, this neighborhood was trapped under the weight of silence. Tonight, that silence is broken, for good. Applause rose, cautious at first, then building like a wave. Marcus presented the audit recovery totals. Tens of thousands of dollars refunded to residents, funds restored for maintenance and repairs. When he finished, people stood and clapped, some wiping away tears. Then Eleanor came forward with a motion. Established the Maplewood Transparency Charter, a set of bylaws guaranteeing open books, term limits, and recorded meetings accessible to every resident. The motion passed unanimously. It wasn't just policy, it was rebirth. In the months that followed, Maplewood transformed. The community pool reopened, free from the shadow of favoritism. Mrs. Chen's flower beds blossomed again, bright with marigolds and jasmine. Earl's flag flew proudly from his porch without a single citation. The neighborhood newsletter, once filled with threats and fees, now featured recipes, birthdays, and volunteer calls. I started a woodworking club on Saturdays. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact now laughed together over sawdust and coffee. We'd become something Cordelia could never control, a community. Still, I kept the photograph she'd sent me, the one with the words, "This isn't over." It sat in my desk drawer under the Maplewood file, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Power unchecked becomes corruption. Vigilance keeps it honest. One evening, I was in my workshop when I heard a knock on the door. It was Marcus carrying a folder. "State legislature's considering a bill," he said, eyes bright. "They're calling it the Maplewood Act, stricter oversight for HOAs statewide." I smiled, running a hand over the smooth cedar tabletop. Looks like the ripple's turning into a wave. Months turned into a year. The media coverage faded, the headlines moved on, but Maplewood remained the quiet proof that reform wasn't a fantasy. Property values climbed, not because of restrictions, but because people wanted to live where integrity had roots. Parents felt safe letting their kids play outside again. Veterans gathered at Earl's Memorial Garden every weekend, sharing stories under the flag that once symbolized defiance but now meant belonging. One summer evening, during our annual block party, Eleanor raised a toast. "To Michael," she said, her voice trembling with warmth, "for reminding us that the law isn't a weapon, it's a shield." The crowd cheered, glasses clinking, laughter spilling into twilight. I looked around. The glow of string lights, the smell of grilled food, the sound of children chasing each other across lawns, and I realized this was the justice I'd always believed in. Not the kind delivered in courtrooms, but the kind that lives in the small, everyday acts of fairness that keep communities whole. Later that night, as I sat on my porch with Scout asleep at my feet, I opened my journal for the first time in months. I wrote, "Justice doesn't end with a verdict. It begins when ordinary people choose courage over comfort." I closed the book, leaned back, and watched the sky fade from gold to deep blue. Somewhere beyond the trees, a neighbor's wind chime sang softly. A week later, I received an email from a town 2 states away. "Judge Webb," it began, "we heard what happened in Maplewood. Our HOA's facing similar corruption. Could you advise us?" I smiled, fingers hovering over the keyboard before typing back a single sentence. Of course. Every community deserves a fair chance. That's how it started again, a ripple turning into a movement. Workshops, consultations, reform committees. I spoke at town halls, not as a judge, but as a neighbor who'd seen both sides of the system. Each time I told Maplewood's story, I could feel the audience leaning forward, the same way my neighbors had when they first believed change was possible. Maybe that's what hope sounds like, the collective inhale before a community decides to fight back. Now, years later, when I walk through Maplewood's streets, I still see traces of what we endured, scars turned to lessons. The park bench, where I first planned to confront Cordelia, now bears a small plaque, in honor of those who chose courage over silence. Mrs. Chen's garden blooms brighter every spring. Marcus's electrical business sponsors the annual charity fair. The laughter of children echoes across the pool deck each evening, pure and unburdened. Sometimes new residents ask me about the old HOA scandal. I just smile and tell them, that's ancient history, but the lesson still stands. Because in the end, justice doesn't live in verdicts or sentences, it lives in people. In every neighbor who dares to speak up, in every community that refuses to bow to intimidation, in every moment someone says, enough, that's the real victory. Not just the fall of corruption, but the rise of trust. As I sit on my porch tonight, the air thick with the scent of cut grass and distant barbecues, I realize Maplewood isn't just my neighborhood anymore, it's a symbol. Proof that even the smallest community can stand tall when good people unite. Scout stirs beside me, letting out a contented sigh, and somewhere in the distance, fireworks pop softly against the dark. Maybe they're from another celebration, or maybe it's just life reminding me that peace, when earned, sounds a lot like freedom.